Welcome, everyone. Thanks for listening. I just want to go over a brief introduction of what cognitive psychology is throughout this PowerPoint. So I'm going to try and make this one a little fast, and we'll get into more detail as we get through more PowerPoints later in the semester. So welcome to exploring a little bit of cognitive psychology, typically chapter 1 in most textbooks. We are, starting this journey together to further explore the scientific study of the mind and mental processes. So think about everything your brain is doing right now. It's interpreting sounds or text, recalling what psychology is, planning dinner, maybe filtering distractions. All of this is happening simultaneously. And cognitive psychology helps us understand those invisible processes. So the objectives that you should understand by the end of the chapter would be to understand how cognitive psychology defines the mind, recognize major historical contributions, and explain how the field has evolved through the cognitive revolution. Pay attention to how the field shifted over time. This historical context matters for understanding why modern cognitive psychology looks the way it does. Cognitive psychology examines how the mind works, how we think, learn, remember, solve problems. Most mental processes can't be observed directly. We infer them through behavior. For example, forgetting a word or solving a puzzle shows internal processing. So, just some questions to consider, and I have a few additional ones you can think about as well. Um, how do we remember information? Why do we forget? How does perception shape reality? How do we solve problems or make decisions? These questions, along with the ones listed on the slide, help us guide cognitive research and our central themes within this course. The complexity of cognition. So, cognition isn't just thinking, it includes perception, memory, language, attention, problem solving, reasoning, and decision making. These processes can often occur automatically without conscious awareness, something like reading without thinking about decoding letters. Cognitive psychology equals the field of study. Cognition equals the mental processes themselves. For example, when you read cat, you don't consciously decode each letter. Cognition handles that silently within our brains. So, thinking more about the mind allows us to imagine possibilities, plan future actions, replay memories, create art, solve problems, and even experience emotions. It creates mental representations of the world so that we can navigate it, like knowing where your kitchen is without actually seeing it. So, Donders is one of the theorists that is discussed in this chapter that we'll take a look at. But before behaviorism dominated, there were several early researchers that tried to scientifically study the mind, and their methods were the foundation for modern cognitive research. So we'll look a little bit further into Donders, we'll look at Wundt, Ebbinghaus, as well as James. And you can see Donders did some work on reaction time. That's what this experiment on the slide talks about. So your textbook should go back into more detail on that, and we'll discuss it a little further as we go as well. This is a modern version of Donders' 1868 reaction time experiment. And so A on the left side is the simple reaction time task, and B on the right is the choice reaction time task. So in the simple reaction time task, the participant pushes the J key when the light goes on. In the choice reaction time task, the participant pushes the J key if the left light goes on and the K key if the right light goes on. And so the purpose of Donder's experiment was to determine how much time it took to decide which key to press in the choice reaction time test. And his logic, was if choice takes longer than simple reaction, the extra time equals the decision time. And so this was huge at the time, and it showed mental processes can be measured indirectly. The sequence of events between the presentation of the stimulus and the behavioral response in Donner's experiments is what we see here. So A is the simple reaction time task, and B on the right is the choice reaction time task. And then the dashed line indicates that Donner's measured reaction time, which would be the time between presentation of the light and the person's or participant's response. And so simple RT um, reaction time equals, you press the button when the light appears. Choice reaction time, you press one button for red light and another for blue light. And then the difference would be 1/10 of a second. Very tiny, but it is something that is considered to be measurable. And just some key takeaways. We cannot see decision making, but we can infer it through the reaction time differences. And so this experiment or example from Donders was pretty much the birth of cognitive measurement. So Wilhelm Wundt is most known for establishing the first scientific lab, which he did so in Germany. And he studied structuralism and introspection. And so, in 1879, when he founded this first lab, this is what made psychology a science. And structuralism aimed to break conscious experience into sensations, sort of like elements of experience. And introspection was used so that participants described internal experiences. But there are some limitations. Obviously it's subjective, it's inconsistent, and you cannot observe unconscious processes. Ebbinghaus looked at memory and forgetting, and he had this curve um, as part of his uh, description and experiment with understanding memory. And so he studied memory scientifically using nonsense syllables to avoid prior meaning. And so he tested how long it took to relearn lists after delays. With the forgetting curve, basically, Ebbinghaus, decided that through his research, the longer you go without practicing information or reviewing information, the more likely you are to forget the information. And so this savings example, calculating the savings score in Ebbinghaus's experiment, this example, it took 1,000 seconds to learn the list of nonsense syllables for the first time. And this is indicated by the lines at 0 and the time needed to relearn the list at delays of A, which is 19 minutes, B, which is 1 day, and C, which is 6 days, are indicated by the line to the right of the 0 line. And so the red arrows indicate the savings score for each delay. And you'll want to notice that the savings decrease for longer delays. And this decrease in savings provides a measure of forgetting. So savings is how much faster material is relearned later. He discovered that forgetting happens rapidly first, and then it kind of levels out. And, this theory of his still influences a lot of the modern memory research that we have today. So this savings curve, Ebbinghaus considered the percent savings to be a measure of the amount remembered. So he plotted this versus the time between initial learning and testing. And the decrease in savings or remembering with increasing delays indicates that forgetting occurs rapidly over the first 2 days, and then it occurs more slowly after that. And this is all based on his research from 1885 to 1913. Um, that takes us into William James, and he was an early American psychologist, um, sort of the creator of functionalism. So opposite of Wundt, which was structuralism, we have William James, which focuses on functionalism. And he looked at how the mind functions in everyday life. And he emphasized habits, attention, consciousness. He's less experimental, but also like the father of American um, cognitive psychology and very influential for his time. Early cognitive research faded as behaviorism rose, and behaviorism focused only on observable behavior and not the mind. And so with cognitive psychology, we look to focus more on the mind. So John Watson did the little Albert experiment, and that's probably what he's most known for, like 1919, 1920. And so this would fall underneath classical conditioning, which you're probably familiar with Pavlov and the salivating dog. Uh, and so Watson believed that psychology should only study observable actions. And so he conditioned a fear response in little Albert by pairing a rat with loud noise. And this helped to demonstrate classical conditioning in humans. And so when he uh, paired the loud noise with things like a white rat, a bunny, a dog, a monkey, even like a Santa Claus face, a blanket. And so little Albert was fine with all of these objects at first until he paired it with this loud banging noise. And once he paired it with the loud banging noise, little Albert was scared of the loud noise, therefore became scared of all these different items that were presented to him. And so this is associative learning. He's learning to associate that loud noise with all of these different objects presented to him, therefore becoming conditioned to be fearful of all of these objects. And so you might remember from intro, like UCS, UCR, CS, and CR. The unconditioned stimulus in the little Albert case would be the loud noise. The unconditioned response would be his fear or crying, something like that. And then the CS, the conditioned stimulus, is all of these different objects that he's now scared with that we paired with the loud noise. So the rat, the blanket, the dog, the monkey, all of that would be the conditioned stimulus. Uh, and so generalization has taken place here. And so he's basically generalizing this fear with all of these different furry objects. So he's essentially scared of furry things. And then the conditioned response would also be the fear, crying, something like that is what we would see with little Albert. Totally unethical by today's standards. But of course, over 100 years ago, we had very different APA ethics than we do today. There's been a lot of question as to what happened to little Albert after. And everybody wants to know, was he conditioned forever? How did this affect him as an adult? We don't have answers to those questions. And I've done a lot of digging and to try to figure out what happened. And I can't say this information is accurate, but from what I have found, I believe that in 1925, uh, little Albert, which his real name was Douglas, died of hydrocephalus to the brain. And so we don't know long term how this might have impacted him. And like I said, I can't say that's 100% accurate, but that's, I believe, what is thought to have happened to little Albert. Nothing related to this experiment, separate issue altogether, but we don't know long term what this might have done. I mentioned Pavlov briefly, so this is his famous experiment where he paired a ringing bell with the presentation of food. And initially, the presentation of food caused the dog to salivate, right? If you hold up food, a big juicy steak, something like that, the dog is going to salivate. He's going to drool. But after we pair the bell with the food, bell food, bell food, bell food, right? That association is being made, we're still getting the same salivating response. So eventually you can pull the bell, or I'm sorry, pull the food, just ring the bell, and you're going to get the salivation. So the UCS is the food, the UCR is salivating, the CS is the bell, and the CR would be salivating. And if you look at my YouTube page, I have other videos out there that go more in detail into classical conditioning, as well as Skinner's theory here, operant conditioning. So feel free to check those out. But Skinner looked at operant conditioning and behaviorism and used reinforcement and punishment to shape behavior. Uh, he thought that behaviorism dominated for decades because it was measurable and observable. And so he looked at the positive and negative reinforcement, positive, negative punishment. And so just to kind of go over briefly what that is, reinforcement, we always want behavior to continue. We either add or take away to make that happen. Punishment, we always want behavior to stop. And so we add a punishment or take something away to make that happen as well. The one that students struggle with the most that I see in classes is probably negative reinforcement. So let me give you a couple examples of that. If you take aspirin to when you have a headache, that would be considered negative reinforcement. And so the headache is being removed. So that's going to encourage the behavior of taking the aspirin. Another one would be a predator runs up a tree, I'm sorry, an animal runs up a tree to escape a predator. So let's say a squirrel goes up the tree, right? We're removing the predator, and that's going to encourage the behavior to continue of running up the tree. So negative reinforcement. Uh, and like I said, I have other PowerPoints out there, so if you need more examples, feel free to check those out. And this is kind of a brief timeline that shows early experiments and the rise of behaviorism from the 1800s to the 1900s. We started to focus more on stimuli or the response, nothing internal. So Tolman's research in 1938 trained rats to find food in a four-armed maze, and this kind of gives you a description of what that was like. Rats learned the layout of the maze using cognitive maps and not stimulus response habits. And so in this experiment, there's evidence of mental representation, and it was really a major challenge to behaviorism. The maze used by Tolman, in A, the rat initially explores the maze, excuse me, and then B, the rat learns to turn right to obtain food at B when it starts at A. And then in C, when placed at C, the rat turns left to reach the food at B. And so in this experiment, precautions are taken to prevent the rat from knowing where the food is based on cues such as smell. I left this in here just so that you can kind of maybe take a moment, pause, think about what you just learned with Tolman's experiment. Uh, you could even go back and think about Pavlov or, Skinner and what you know for them. And the next slide, it will give you the answers to these questions for Tolman's experiment. So you might want to pause, jot down a few notes, think for yourself what Tolman's experiment was about, and then you can read the answers on the next slide. You can pause here again if you need to, and just kind of read and think and recap what Tolman's experiment was about. Take the time that you need on this slide before proceeding to the rest. So now we move into the kind of decline of behaviorism. Um, there's a lot of controversy over language. Skinner looked at verbal behavior, argued that children learn language through operant conditioning, through the use of reinforcement and punishment, that they tend to imitate speech. Correct speech is rewarded. So if they use correct speech or they say please or thank you, then they're rewarded for that. So Chomsky argued a little bit different than Skinner and thought that children don't only learn language through imitation and reinforcement, but they also say things that they've never heard. And so if they're saying things they haven't heard, that can't be imitating then, right? Um, Chomsky also thought that children say things that are incorrect, and that things that they have not been rewarded for, He doesn't think that it's only through reinforcement. Observation, children say sentences they've never heard. That suggests some type of innate language ability. So, not just learning through uh, imitation. Rebirth, we're looking at the mind compared to computer, process input, it stores, it retrieves. Operations are staged and structured. Thomas Kuhn looked at some of the shifts that we have in the research that's been current up until 1962. He came out with the structure of scientific revolutions. And so this looked at the paradigm shifts in cognitive ability. The shift from behaviorist stimulus response relationships to an approach that attempts to explain behavior in terms of the mind. We look at information processing approach. That's a newer term. Um, there's a decline in behaviorism versus the rise of information processing, and computers are a part of that, and they help to revolutionize cognitive um, cognitive theory, really. We move a little bit in these 5 years from 1953, which we were still often looking at James's idea of attention, into this more flow type of diagram in 1958 that Broadbent came out with, and you'll see a picture of that on the next slide. This flow diagram for an early computer shows us, which would be A, right? The flow diagram for the early computer is A. B is the flow diagram for Broadbent's filter model of attention. And so the diagram shows many messages entering a filter, which selects the message to which the person is attending for further processing by a detector. And then from there, it transfers into short-term memory. The timeline here shows events associated with the decline of the influence of behaviorism, which is above the line, and events that led to the development of the information processing approach to cognitive psychology, which would be below the line. AI is what we see today, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And so this idea of artificial intelligence aims to model human thinking. And so we had early programs like Logic Theorist that solved math problems. This has been in the development for quite some time, leading all the way to what we have with ChatGPT today and some of the other ones similar to that. Modern cognitive psychology today, the field now includes perception, memory, language, decisions, attention, as well as neuropsychology too. Atkins and Shiffrin is another set of theorists that developed a three-stage model, and they talked about sensory, right? Information comes in through the sensory system, and then it's transferred into short-term, or sometimes what we call working memory. Has a very limited capacity. Short-term memory is 12 to 30 seconds. And then, if you can get it past the short-term memory, then you've got long-term memory capability, and that's, longer duration as well as high capacity too. And this just shows you a diagram of Atkin and Shiffrin's model. This was done in 1968, so the information comes in through the sensory input, and then we have to rehearse, right? That's what gets it past the short-term memory into the long-term memory, where we can then retrieve it later at a later date as needed. But that rehearsal is key. Other terms that you might be familiar with from your intro to psych class would be episodic memory. These are typically life events. If you think about different big events in your life happening as episodes, right? And so episodes might be like your high school graduation, the marriage, the birth of your child. These are all episodes of our life that we tend to store in long-term memory. Semantic is just facts, general knowledge sometimes that we know. Procedural is more of a physical action or uh, learning how to do something step by step, riding a bike, things like that. First you learn to get on the bike, then you learn to balance, then you pedal, and you learn to balance as you pedal, those types of things. Uh, but Tulving here looked at episodic memory and personal memories and semantics being facts and procedural being skills. And these systems operate differently in the brain. Neuropsychology for cognitive psych looks more at the studies that of behavior in people with brain damage. And so we have better tools to do that with today. And so the brain imaging, the fMRI, the PET scans, all of this allows us to see which regions activate during different tasks that are completed. And so this connects psychology with the neuroscience world. So again, these are just, self-assessment things that you could think about, things you want to remember as we progress throughout the class. What are some of your muddiest points? Like, what are you still struggling with? You can always feel free to reach out to me if you need more information on something. It might be something that you want to look into more detail yourself, uh, but this is just some ideas to keep you thinking. This is just some key takeaways or, summary of the chapter. Um, looking at introspection, behaviorism, cognitive revolution. This chapter lays the foundation for everything else that we're going to talk about in cognitive psychology. So thank you for listening, and we will definitely have more chapters for cognitive psych. So take a look at my YouTube channel or in the course room as needed and reach out with questions. Thanks.